Hey everybody, Dr. Jared Pelo. I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Abbie Smith-Ryan from UNC, where she is a professor in exercise and sports science. So she joined UNC in 2011. She has 160 plus publications at this point. She specializes in exercise, nutrition, and body composition, and how those affect cardiovascular health, metabolic health, and specifically around female health, which is super cool. She is one of my favorite people in the exercise science, body composition, and nutrition area. We will talk to her many times, but please enjoy our conversation where we took a deep dive on body composition. Thank you, Abbie, for joining me today. Would love for you to give just a little bit of background on what you do.
Yeah, hey Jared, always great to chat with you. So I am a research nerd, professor at the University of North Carolina, where I direct a laboratory where we do all human subjects, exercise and nutrition-based trials. But in the concept of today, one of my expertise is in body composition measurement, interpretation, and application.
So I'm super curious, at what point in your life were you like, I want to see what people are made up of?
It's funny that you asked that. It actually was one of my first interests. So I was a collegiate distance runner, and we always had our skin fold measures repeatedly. And I found, I wasn't so concerned with the number, but I found when my value got to a certain level, particularly a low level, it was when I got injured. And there was all these conversations about bone, but in reality, like my bones were very strong. Like it wasn't a bone aspect. And so it was in college where I started to wonder and see like, oh, I don't look like that person, but I'm performing better. Or do you have, like, bodies are just different? And so it's been an interest of mine for a long time. And I think some of the fuel for the fire is that it's so misunderstood. And I think it's so important. And so I have this passion to stay in the field as a way to help improve the education around it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how many of us, we become passionate about things because they affect us personally, or we have personal experiences with it. So I love to hear that about you. And I'm curious, so often is in the case with science, I feel like lay people feel like we know a lot more than we do. Like, I wonder if people are like, research around body comp, like why would we need to do research around body comp? What are some of the questions that we still need to answer?
Oh, there's so many. And I think even researchers still don't know a lot about how to use body composition. And part of it is exciting because there's new technology. So as the technology changes, we really have to rephrase our questions to understand what is our body measuring. But when we think about body composition as a whole, and I think one of the most important things, you might get a value, and someone might be talking about a value, but no one ever connects it back to how it was measured. And these devices are all so different. They give you all such different values. So it leads us to then ask, well, what is it measuring and what does it mean? And I think it's also a missing link where our society is so focused on weight, when in reality, like you could do a lot of things to gain weight or lose weight, and it's actually impacting the compartments of your body and not your weight. Or, for example, you could maintain weight and your body is quite changing. And so there is so much we need to know, but luckily, I mean, we do have some of that. But as technology changes, the questions are endless.
Yeah. So you mentioned compartments of your body. Tell me kind of like, how do you think about body composition?
Oh gosh. Okay. How do I think about body composition? I think it is one of the most important things related to health. And I say that because you cannot look at a person and know whether they're healthy or not. Even if they have excess fat or they are very lean, that does not tell us about their health. And I'll juxtapose that. Like, we've done a lot of work with bodybuilders, which is one of the most unhealthy sports. But as you look at them, they look like very lean. At the same time, we look at a lot of what we call the obesity paradox with obese individuals, yet cardiovascularly, they're very healthy. And the only way to know that is to look inside the body, is to look at what is the body made of. So our bone, our skeleton, our muscle, not only our fat mass, but also kind of how much fat is in our muscle quality, and then where we store some of that. So for example, in our legs and our hips and our abs, both fat and muscle. And then, the other piece that you don't measure from body composition is our heart, our cardiovascular health, which is all tied together. And so much of that is directly related to our health that you can't tell by just weight.
Yeah. It's interesting, I feel like the scale, the weight we see on the scale is what drives 99% of people out there. And what do you think? I mean, you mentioned a little bit of what that is missing, but if you were going to kind of pick out the top things that the scale misses that you can get insights with body composition, what are those things?
Well, let me give you a little story and then I'll answer your question. So because I'm a research nerd and look at composition earlier in my career, and being a distance runner earlier in my career, I did like a physique competition with this goal of just how can we change the physique and track that? And within that, my weight did not change. So I was at the exact same weight despite basically losing fat and either gaining muscle or maintaining. The scale did not change whatsoever. So I say that is because the scale, we are so motivated by the scale, but it often doesn't move. And largely the most impact piece is water. And that is impacted by muscle and how much fuel we have in our muscle. So just for example, if you haven't eaten for a while, or you wake up in the morning and you haven't eaten all night, your muscles don't have a lot of carbohydrate, and carbohydrate hold a lot of water, which changes weight. On the opposite, if you eat Thanksgiving and have a lot of carbohydrate and you fill the muscle with carbohydrate, that pulls in more water and therefore your weight increases. And so that's really important. Like, a lot of people will say their weight changes quite dramatically. And you usually see that in individuals that have larger muscles or bigger changes in those, what we call stored carbohydrate. And so it's this unfortunate benchmark that it moves even if you don't try, or doesn't move even when you try.
Right. It's so funny because it makes all the sense in the world. Like, if you compare, a 225 pound like fitness model and a 225 pound unfit person, like we understand they weigh the same. Like, we look at them and we're like, weight doesn't really matter in this case. But for some reason, when it comes to our personal bodies, we think that weight is the most important thing.
Well, yeah, and I think a couple other important pieces is that weight should change over time. We have different kind of weight set points. And again, I'll use myself as an example. I've had 2 children. And if you think about even hormonal changes, when you think about puberty and different life stages, a lot of people will say, oh, I wish I weighed what I did in college, or I wish I did what, in high school. And so I weigh a lot more than I did. But honestly, my body composition is this. I'm leaner now than I was. And so this weight target, we forget that our bodies change and there's a different set point and a reason for that. And that doesn't have to just be fat mass. It can be muscle and it can be bone too. And so I think that's really important. And another thing you said that is a myth, a lot of people will say, well, muscle weighs more than fat. And, I think the weight is also incorporated by BMI. A lot of medical professionals will say, oh, you need to lose weight because of this BMI. When in reality, it doesn't tell us what the body is made of. So it's this additional kind of missing target When we think about muscle and fat, they weigh almost the exact same, but muscle takes up less space. And
Mm-hmm.
so I like that as a target because, for example, if I want my pants to fit different, it's often not weight, it's just changing the fat with the muscle, depending or shifting. So it just gives us a much better tangible goals because those compartments change, whereas often weight does not.
Right. Yeah. So I'm curious, I would love to hear, the different ways to measure body composition and then the fidelity or accuracy of those ways. And we don't have to go super in depth because, I know you do a bunch of research around DEXA. We take our members through DEXA, so we can spend most of our time on DEXA. But, even DEXA has its strong points and weak points. So I'd love to hear just really quickly the different ways that you think about body composition and accuracy or fidelity of that.
Great. And maybe let me circle one other thought when we think about body composition. A lot of people are afraid of the outcome. So body composition are these compartments when everyone in the media is focused on percent body fat, which is the amount of fat over weight, when in reality, that is the least helpful outcome. And I say that because you could maintain percent fat and change the other compartments. And so the motivation to get a measurement is not about percent fat. It really is about knowing how much fat mass you have, how much muscle mass you have, and how do your bones look, if that's an important part of, depending on your life stage. And so as we go into measurement, it does depend on what of those compartments we're trying to capture. And I also think it's really important. People are always so afraid of this taboo topic of, percent body fat, or I'm afraid to measure this, or I have to work out and be really fit before I go get my baseline measure. And I would say it's so valuable to get repeat measures at a normal lifestyle because your body should change. You shouldn't always be the leanest. It does change just based on life. And so then knowing what those targets are. And then the question that you asked was, how do you measure it? And what are the composition techniques? I would say the most common right now, I know the members go through DEXA, but one that's more accessible is what we call bioelectrical impedance analysis. And that is, I like that because there's a range of accessibility. You could get a home scale where you simply stand on it without your socks on. Some of them have the handles, which creates more contact points. And those devices are reliant upon total body water. And that's really important because total body water is the most variable compartment in the body. And that's not just because of the fluid we drink, but because our muscles are full of water. And so those are really nice kind of affordable methods to be able to track. So for example, if you wake up in the morning and measure yourself repeatedly, at the same time of morning, they're pretty consistent. However, because fluid is so variable based on, when was the last time you went to the bathroom, how many carbohydrates did you eat, are you dehydrated, they are not as accurate, but it's nice as a tracking mechanism. And much of the technology now will give you the fat mass and the muscle components. The one thing it doesn't give us is bone, and that's where we start to see DEXA. And interestingly, DEXA was designed just to measure bone, so just skeletal integrity at the spine and the hip or the wrist. And that's an often clinical measurement where you would go, often women, not until their 60s, would be able to do a bone scan, and it's those single sites. What we now see a little bit more widespread, not as much in healthcare, but is to do a total body scan, and it relies on a low-grade radiation to identify density of tissue. So it allows us to identify bone, muscle, and fat mass. It also allows us to identify what I think is really important is regional distribution. Do you store more muscle or fat in your hips versus your abdomen, or your right side versus your left side. And it also gives us some of these initial bone values to identify how we might make some exercise, nutrition, pharmaceutical prescription.
Why do you think regionally it's important?
So important for many reasons. When we first talk about regional distribution of fat mass, we know that if people store more in their abdominal region, it is linked with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But working in this space, and I work with, for example, a lot of bariatric or retired NFL athletes, you cannot tell by looking at someone, particularly in their belly region, if they store more on the outside or store more on the inside. And we would call that visceral fat. And that visceral fat is essentially excess fat that sits on your organs. Your organs have to work harder. And it's that visceral fat that is directly linked to metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And so there's many reasons we would want to see that. One, can we catch it before it gets too high? And then there are lifestyle changes that can help minimize it and at least minimize the gain of that. And so basically by altering that, you can impact health. When we think about muscle, it's very relevant when we think about preventative health care. So as we age, there's lots of joint injuries, knees, shoulders, ankles, even when we think about slips, trips, and falls or surgeries and muscle mass on each side, we can start to see imbalances which can correct. Or when we think about, just for example, a loss of muscle that can be targeted and is directly related to health and quality of life and functionality as someone ages. There's a lot of information in there. I don't know if there's something you want to pull out.
Well, let's talk about abdominal regional fat. So I've heard before that DEXA doesn't even really measure VAT, visceral adipose tissue, accurately. So help us understand how it measures it and how much weight we should put behind kind of what we think about.
So the gold standard of visceral fat measurement is MRI. But having done MRI, it's still an estimate. I mean, we are estimating how much is there. With DEXA algorithm is based on MRI, and so it is an estimate. And then we will also use ultrasound to measure or estimate visceral fat. And so I wouldn't put all my money in the value that it gives. But it is a really helpful estimation of kind of the scale of high, moderate, and low, and how does that value change? It goes back to, I think one of the most valuable things we can do with body composition is to measure change. A single time point isn't always the most effective. It's very effective for creating kind of specific recommendations, but the change piece is really helpful, and that from some of these methods is really helpful in that tracking of how does it change with age or with different lifestyle strategies or medication.
So if I understand correctly, it doesn't, you do care about the number you get, you do care about the VAT number you get, but it's not so much the number that matters, but the directionality of that number. Is it increasing, decreasing? Is it, I'm assuming though, the estimate, we feel comfortable enough with the estimate that if it's really high or really low, we can kind of clinically make decisions about that and say, yes, you probably do have metabolic syndrome because, or you have enough VAT that it's dangerous, or you have too little VAT, you're undernourished. Is that how you'd kind of think about it?
Definitely on the high end. And I always like to pair it, if we're trying to understand health, it is helpful to pair it with clinical outcomes. So for example, blood work. So for example, if I have someone with a moderate amount of VAT and no indications with their blood that there are, any metabolic pre-markers, that's a really important time to make lifestyle changes because that VAT is elevated. We see often, let's say, if a high amount of VAT, you can still have a high amount of VAT and not actually currently yet have some of these metabolic outcomes, but we know that is directly associated. So it's bound to happen without changes.
Hmm.
The low end's a little bit different. You can have zero VAT and be very healthy. And we do see that, like activity and specific. So a lot of my work involves high intensity interval training. And partly why is because that's one of few ways to target visceral fat. And so it just allows us to make more prescriptive recommendations based on how much visceral fat. The other really important thing too is it starts to help have that conversation about genetics. If you're predisposed to some of these things, your visceral fat could be an initial indicator. And also visceral fat is quite high in individuals that have a lot of alcohol consumption. So again, it gives us an idea of maybe you have a very healthy lifestyle, but drink a lot of alcohol, or you, live a healthy lifestyle, but have a predisposed genetic risk for some things. And that might show up first in your visceral fat.
I really like that idea that you can use VAT as a pre-indicator of possible disease in the future. What are kind of the cutoffs that you use to say this amount of VAT is concerning? We want to get you below this amount.
It's a great question. I mean, I think that's another reason why it's not like all or nothing is there's not great normative data, and it depends on the specific DEXA or what method. But I would say, it's more, I can't give you an exact value. Usually, there are some norms. It's above the 50th percentile in general for both that and body fat. Body composition is where we want to have that. Let's take a closer look.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know that even, body composition data, the NHANES data set, which is the national data set we use to understand body composition, I mean, the first ones didn't even have visceral adipose tissue. And so
yes, so they didn't have the algorithm. The software didn't measure it. And
yeah.
So now they have it because it's a new estimation. But one thing to think about is if someone wears a lot of tight pants around their waist, when measuring, it will change that visceral fat estimation. And so it just shows like the way you measure and the limitations of some of this, which would then impact how you might categorize someone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes me just wonder procedurally, when somebody comes into your lab, do you make sure that their pants aren't tight?
Yes. Or we give them different pants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, I think it's a really important conversation because you hear in the media like, oh, you can't target abdominal fat and you can't target visceral fat. When in reality, you can, not by doing a bunch of crunches. But that's where those changes are really helpful of like tracking changes and understanding like what's normal for you, which is why these assessments are so important. Like what is a normal value for you can change, and it allows you to establish those goals based on you and your lifestyle.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I find super interesting about body composition is, I feel like over the last 10 years, there's been so many different movements, especially social media helping push movements, but, the health at every size and those types of movements, I think, you've said some really interesting things. Like you can't necessarily tell just by looking at somebody how healthy they are. But also there are some pre-indications. If we see a certain amount of visceral adipose tissue, then we know that it's coming, that, poor health will come if we don't make some changes. So I'm curious, like when you think about kind of health at every size or body composition and using it for health, like how might you think about it differently than maybe you hear about like on social media?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and it's a target we haven't talked about yet. Like, I actually don't first look at visceral fat. I
Hmm.
do look at it as a starting point to ask about lifestyle. Usually, high visceral fat is related to pretty poor lifestyle, and so it is a good way to look at that. To me, where I start is actually muscle mass.
Hmm.
And when we think about muscle mass, just for instance, I have sometimes measured people 300 or 400 pounds, and you would think that they would be, at poor health. Obviously, like lots of things impact that. But if they are someone that has more muscle, it actually has a lot of protective effects against chronic disease. And so it's really more allowing us to identify how much muscle do you have, where is it located, and can that help us be a target? Everyone is so focused on fat. And sometimes that's helpful. Like that won't never come into the picture, but it's this really futile cycle where we're always trying to lose fat when that shouldn't always be our goal. Like, we need fat. It protects our joints. It it gives us less wrinkles. Whereas muscle is such an under talked about and rated compartment of the body, and it has so much impact on health and quality of life, and that should be our target. And so I really use the measurement of body composition to better understand muscle size, the amount of muscle, and how that's changing. And I would say muscle is more malleable than fat. We know how to change muscle. Fat gets a little bit hard because we have lots of fat storage, and our fat cells like kind of just appear and never go away. Yeah, and so like as a physiologist, muscle is a much better target, and we know a little bit more how to change that.
Awesome. I recently read Dr. Gabby Lyons' book,
Mm.
and she talks a lot about muscle centric medicine, and she might make more of a dichotomy than I would, where she says, we have a muscle problem, not an obesity problem, and that's kind of, you said, let's focus on muscle, not fat. I might say like we have both problems,
Mm-hmm.
but I would love to hear. So you said you focus on muscle first. So what are the measurements that you focus on when you get a body composition back? And like, if you have any idea around the scale that you would use to say, I like to see this kind of muscle mass or composition or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the easiest, most straightforward measure, that's why I like DEXA to start, because muscle is also directly related to bone. So when we think about muscle, it does depend on the size of the person and the skeleton. So there is some normative data, and I'm just thinking, like, I guess as a woman, that's what I'm thinking about right now. But it depends on the size of the person as well. So I look to first see, are they at a good kind of normative level of muscle, and that's really going to depend on age, weight, sex, and race. But then I can start to say, like, oh, that is lower than it should be, total body muscle. Then we can also look at lower body muscle. And I focus on that because lower body muscle, we know, is directly related to functionality. If you're able to maintain, I always give the example of, have you ever seen the old people with no butts? Like, we want to avoid that, because those are the people that can't get up out of bed, more risk of falling, lower, quality of life and longevity. And so there usually is a target, and there's a couple values we look at, would be fat-free mass index or appendicular lean mass index. And it really just takes into account the amount of muscle over height to give some normative values. And it's still a loaded question, but again, you're asking a researcher. Like, we are even developing now normative data, for example, female athletes versus male athletes across different sports, to really say how much muscle is optimal and how can we flag it, for example, for injury prevention. And so there's a lot of work still left to be done, but we do have enough to say like, oh, we're in a good spot, or, you know, like you can look at a value to understand. The other really important piece is when we think about muscle and the connection to bone is muscle pulls on the bone. That's where it's connected. And so if you have a small amount of muscle, it's almost always related to a low bone density, which most people are aware of low bone density. And so if we take the opposite, that one of the best ways to build bone density is to build bigger, stronger muscles to pull on the bone. So they're directly related. And again, when you take skeleton and muscle, like those are key parts of the body that will propel your health and quality of life to the end.
Yeah. And I feel like there, like you said, it comes down to age, sex, race. There are differences at different ages, what you worry about. I mean, I think if you see a 20-year-old and they have poor bone health, then you're going to be pretty worried that they went through some sort of nutritional problems in their younger life or some sort of health issues. Maybe they're on corticosteroids or something. But when you mentioned athletes and kind of muscle mass and injuries, when you think, let's take for an example, if you had like a 45-year-old woman and she comes in and you see a certain amount of muscle mass, her fat-free mass index or her appendicular lean mass index are a certain percentile. And let's just use like normative population percentiles, just because that person could be all different sizes, like you said. Mm-hmm. What kind of percentile do you think, okay, this person is on a great path, or this person, they probably need to make some lifestyle changes to try to add some muscle?
It's a good question. I mean, there's more inputs than just that, but it's the opposite of fat mass. So for example, someone at the 25th percentile would be someone I would be having some direct conversations with. Same thing at the 50th percentile. Like that would at least be like, okay, you're on average, but we're comparing you against this pretty unhealthy population. And so almost anyone, to be honest, like we all should be more muscle centric, but I do spend a lot of time having this conversation with women specifically in this age group. And this is a really important point because so many women are trying to lose weight. And the way they do that is by exercising more and eating less. And honestly, that is the perfect storm for losing muscle. And so we're like killing ourselves to do all this stuff. We feel terrible. And we are also hurting our health. Like we are losing muscle. And so, yeah, a lower value, like I said, even the 50th percentile, even someone that is in the 75th percentile for muscle mass, I will still have this conversation, especially as we age, because our body utilizes proteins and turns over the muscle differently as we age. So for example, if we take that 45-year-old female, she could do the same thing to her muscle she did when she was 35, and it won't respond the same. She may likely lose muscle. So even if she's normal and at a healthy spot, it would still be a very important part of the conversation. Same thing for a man. It seems to be a bit more accelerated in women. And I think that's really important component when we think about what are we measuring and how is that changing. That muscle piece is often not talked about, one, because it's not measured. So knowing where you start is really important.
Yeah. When you talk with women about adding muscle, I've had plenty of conversations with women at this point, and it's funny how many I still hear, like, I don't want to look like a man. They're like, I don't want to get too big. And I'm just like, how many women do you see walking around who are too big? Like, even at the gym, like, you don't walk into the gym and think, oh, all these women are huge. And I also find the younger generation of women seem like much more interested in working out, lifting heavy, and I think social media has a big part to do with that. But when you talk with women, say 45 to 55 years old, how do you kind of talk to them about adding muscle, like what they should focus on?
Well, first, unfortunately, we don't have enough testosterone to build muscle like a man. And so heavy lifting will not, you have to work really hard to build muscle. And so that won't change, like that won't make you look masculine. But what we focus on a lot is targeting muscle actually increases metabolic rate and therefore helps us build our kind of calorie and energy goals without doing anything. So if I have more muscle and I'm continually breaking down that muscle by lifting weights, it kind of directly impacts caloric expenditure and overall utilization, which then I can eat more and like my metabolism is higher. The other really cool thing, what I mentioned earlier, is that muscle takes up less space than fat. And so often if you are replacing muscle with fat, your weight's not changing, but your clothes fit very different. And you
Mm-hmm.
can visibly see that and feel that. It's one of those things. And so, yeah, we talk a lot about just their goals. And I do think it's not just women, but it is particularly projected at us that the best way to improve body composition is walk and do a lot of cardio, when in reality it's not. That makes it harder. And so we talk, how do we build muscle both in the gym and on our plates? And the nice thing too is it doesn't have to take a lot of time and be really scary. It's just doing those tools that are really effective. And I think the other piece that's really important is muscle is also, and the kind of lifting to support muscle is very protective for our joints if done correctly. And so as we age, most of us are going to deal with joint pain and et cetera. And training, resistance training actually supports that by building muscle, kind of protect those. So we talk a lot about the functionality of it and the easy way to burn calories by doing nothing.
Yeah. At some point, I can't wait to talk with you again more about kind of the exercise side of things, because as much as I love Peter Attia, when you listen to the amount of exercise he recommends people do, it's like, I don't know how anybody has that many hours in the week. When he talks about, he does an hour of stability a day, an hour of weight training a day, an hour of cardio. Like
some of us have jobs.
Yeah, I'm just like, I don't know how that works. And so talking about like efficient exercise and, high intensity interval and those types of things, I'm going to have you back and we can talk about all that. One thing you mentioned though, you mentioned building muscle on the plate, like using the plate as a tool. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So it goes against, when we think about weight loss, which it's what everyone's driving, if we reframe that to say, like, we actually want to feel better, have more energy, and our clothes fit better, that's really talking about body composition and muscle. And I know I was taught, especially as an endurance athlete, of like, the more calories you burn, the more you can eat. When in reality, that's not how it should be. And most often we're under fueling, and then we don't feel as good and don't have as much energy. And so there's also a saying that most people say, like, you can't out exercise a bad diet. And I say that because if we can make consistent choices starting on our plate, it has a huge impact on our composition and on our cognitive and mental health. And I am a busy mom. I have a very stressful job. And all these recommendations are just so that we don't have time for that. Like, give me, what can we do now? And what do I teach my children that has practical takeaways? And it's very simple, like building your plate, like first start with about 30 grams of protein. For my kids, it's not quite 30, but it is 10 grams of protein. How do I build my meal around a protein base? We do need more as we age. So like as I get older, I'll shoot for 35 grams, 40 grams. And then I add something green, some sort of fresh fruit or vegetable. I prioritize vegetables and add in fruits. So fresh, there's lots of vitamins and minerals. And then if I need to, depending on my workout, add a starch and, some fats, depending, not thinking too hard about those things, but really prioritizing a protein and a green. I don't need usually to encourage someone to add more carbohydrates. They're delicious. They're easier to come by. You don't have to prep them. And it's just very simple. And the nice thing too is you can do that whether you're at a restaurant, whether you're at the airport, whether you're at your in-laws. And it really helps us stay full. And it helps us provide enough amino acids and nutrients to maintain muscle. And so it's not even about building muscle. Like everyone's so worried about building. Like I'm just trying to prevent any loss. In that it's being more focused about that. The other interesting thing is when you start to build your plate like that, you're not hungry or grabbing the little snack or the little meal that you thought you were trying to do to lose weight. You're really fueling yourself, not just for exercise, but for your day.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating because it's consistency that pays off, but not perfection. Like sometimes, like, I don't know about you, maybe not for you, but for me, sometimes I might still just eat pizza, like for a meal. And like, that's okay. But most of the time I try to do, like you said, like build around a protein, have fruits and vegetables be part of that. And just having that consistency and learning that framework is just super helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, let's use your pizza example. So it's often more food. So for example, if I'm going to have pizza, I like some veggies and protein on my pizza. But let's say we do cheese pizza, then what I'll also do is I'm going to add a salad, whether I make it or I just buy it, and I'm going to get a chicken breast on top. It's more food. So I'm still going to have my pizza, but I'm also going to have that green and the protein. The other thing my weakness is I don't love like potatoes, but I every night probably have some corn chips. Like I'll build my chicken and my vegetable, and then my carbohydrate is like a corn chip. Yeah. And so again, it's not like that's just not what I put a lot of time into. And you can still eat processed foods. It's just what are you filling up on and where are you starting? And it's quite valuable to teach our families that too. Like my children know what that looks like. And it doesn't have to always be animal proteins. For example, they might have, a bagel and cream cheese and a cheese stick, and then their vegetables. So it's really just changing our mindset versus calories and, easy, on the go, low calorie options.
Yeah. And nutrition is fascinating. I'll have to have you back to talk about nutrition too. But I think, protein is fascinating, and how, fats we actually separate out into unsaturated and saturated. And like protein, we just say protein, and we don't say, a complete protein versus, an incomplete plant protein or whatever. But honestly, I don't think it's that important to I think simplicity is the key when it comes to these types of things. And even, I love continuous glucose monitors. I think they're great tools for learning something, but there's so much complexity that you can go into with timing of food and stuff like that I think is completely useless. And I think when it comes down to it, what's really useful is get enough protein, get enough vegetables, get enough fruit, that you're full. And then those other things, you don't have to tell people you can eat carbs.
Yeah. Well, and I actually think timing is one of those things that's really important, because I know for myself, if I don't remind myself or bring my food, I'm like, oh, I'm not hungry, or I'll just skip a meal. When in reality, then that changes your hunger hormones and your metabolism. So there is an element of sometimes eating maybe when you're not hungry as you're building your metabolism. It's just making sure those are those high quality foods. And it goes against our busy lifestyles and what we are taught. And so prioritizing eating of those things can be really helpful. And as you said, consistency, not just of nutrition, but of kind of targeting the muscle is really important. This is not something, we should not be exercising hours every day. Great if you have the time and you love that, but it's more about short, kind of consistent, not as much as possible, but kind of keeping that in your lifestyle will have the biggest impact over time.
Yeah. Well, obviously lots more to talk about another time, but Abbie, thank you so much. I think we did a great job kind of going over, visceral adipose tissue. Why do we care about that? A great job talking about fat-free mass index, appendicular lean mass index, how we think about muscle. Body fat percentage, we didn't really talk that much about, which I think is great, honestly. I think, like you said, we hear about it in the media, and I think because it's an aesthetic thing. And that seems to be what drives a lot of people's decisions is they want to look great, however. And not that they shouldn't. I think we all want to look great. But I agree with you that the focus, when we focus on the right things, when we focus on muscle, when we focus on our metabolic health, those things, like you said, clothes fit better, you feel better, all those things. So anything that you would like to finish up with before we finish today?
Well, I want to say, it's not just about looking good, it's about feeling good. And we know that if we are just striving for a weight or a percent fat, it doesn't go hand in hand with feeling good. And so I think changing this narrative of how we look, we also need to feel good. And there's ways to do both. And then not to be afraid of body composition. I wish everyone had their measurement. And honestly, I do mine every 6 to 9 months, even after I've, not been as consistent. And it's really helpful to start to say, oh, I could see how my lifestyle choices have impacted that. And I know how to change it. And I think that's the other piece is no matter where you are, what age you are, what life stage, that's what's so cool is your body will adapt. I have seen 80-year-old male and female, put on muscle and build bone. Bone just takes longer. And so that's what's so great is if you know where your body is and you have goals, you can change it. And it is very satisfying to be able to have control over something. And it's not always fat. There's a lot of strength and muscle kind of things that we can target that you can change.
I love that. Such an empowering message that you want this data so that you can actually change and be healthier and feel better. So I love it. Abbie, thank you so much.
Yeah, great chatting with you.
You too.